not been mic'd yet, but I would like to take this opportunity with this session to go away from the prepared speeches that our previous speakers had, and just to sort of go through their mind a little bit about what trade in Africa is going to be like. What is it going to be like in the future, especially in light of the recently signed Africa Free Trade Agreement Protocol that was signed a few days ago in Rwanda. And that really is going to be the theme of the questions I'm going to ask to the panelists who are sitting here. And I'll start at the top level with the Right Honorable Dr. Ruhakana Rugunda, the Prime Minister of the Republic of Uganda. And just to ask, from your point of view, where do you see this recently signed trade agreement protocol taking Africa, and what does it mean to us in the East African community? Right Honorable Rugunda.
First of all, I'm happy that the African leaders have taken this momentous decision of having a continental free trade area. Number two, it is going to promote Africans to trade with Africans primarily before they focus on other areas. As you very well know, in the past, neighbors used to do business with neighbors, to trade with neighbors, to exchange gifts with neighbors. That was the primary market. But Balkanization and colonialism suddenly introduced artificial boundaries, artificial but unfortunately, which built barriers and blocked this centuries-old practice of neighbor trading with neighbors. So this treaty, therefore, is going back to the basics, focusing on African countries doing business with each other, with their neighbors. And as we heard, intra-African trade is still very low indeed. But this treaty, if effectively implemented, is going to catalyze the process of African countries and African people promoting intra-African trade, making it really the foundation for international trade. We should give it unequivocal support.
So that's a very clear statement that the African Free Trade Agreement Protocol is important, and it just goes back to the roots of us as Africans, where we used to exchange gifts one neighbor to the other. To then bring it down to where we are, I'd like to ask Honorable Eden Mohammed, for East Africa, and as a minister in charge, a cabinet secretary in charge of trade, where have we reached with the East African community, and what does the new agreements, in fact there are two, which are in the process of being put forward. One is the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, which had started off between COMESA, the East African Community, and SADC, and now the Africa Free Trade Agreement. What do you think the EAC is going to benefit, or maybe not, with these three protocols all coming together?
Well, thank you very much. First of all, the tripartite covers EAC countries as well as COMESA countries and SADC countries. This has now been, if you like, engulfed with the continental Africa-wide agreement. So the tripartite effectively becomes a subset of the wider African one, which was just signed, this week. In terms of development for any country, the significance of trade, I think, cannot be overemphasized. And what we have suffered from as Africa is our share of global trade is so insignificant that it doesn't look like it matters anymore. Less than 3% or thereabouts of global trade being attributed to Africa is something that is not only embarrassing, but I think have an opportunity that we should take advantage of. And what has led to this to a large extent is our own challenges on the continent, as the Right Honorable Prime Minister mentioned. You know, we have so many difficulties in trading with our neighbors and neighbors' neighbors on the continent that it became so complicated. And that has curtailed investments into our countries, into the continent of Africa. And so what has happened through the signing of this Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is to actually bring that dream alive of making Africa to be one. Hopefully, the boundaries would be more artificial than real, both in terms of movements of goods, but also in terms of enabling people to move from one country to the other. So we expect to benefit immensely through trade that will now not only be restricted within our domestic boundaries as Kenya or as Uganda or Tanzania. And of course, we have enjoyed the benefit of East Africa targeting 150 million people. Now, through this continental free trade, we have the opportunity to target consumers in excess of 1 billion that would be, you know, on the continent of Africa. So it says a lot about attracting investment into Africa that is becoming much more attractive now, but also enabling us to be able to compete for investments. I think once this agreement is ratified, which we hope will happen at the quickest possible time, is that any investor can now come and locate in any of our countries, whether you are Uganda or Tanzania or Kenya, Rwanda or Burundi, and be able to access the 1 billion people across the world. And that is the size of the opportunity and the potential. No more are we restricted by the size of our population or by the landmass of our country. Africa becomes now the big opportunity for us to take advantage of. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Mohammed. So the opportunity goes from 150 million or 160 million to 1 billion. That's really what this is happening for us as people in the private sector and industry in general. That is the opportunity that this brings along. I'd now like to turn to Ambassador Librat Mukeko and ask, we've been working on the East African community for some time now. We've been trying to get our different protocols together, try and open up trade within East African community, and now we're talking about the continental free trade area. From your experience within East Africa, what kind of opportunities or challenges is this going to bring from the operational point of view, which is what you said?
Thank you very much. Well, I think all of you know how East Africa has been involved in some of the most important, what we call the pillars of integration. And traditionally, EAC has worked very much on what we call the customs union pillar. And we have made a lot of progress. And as you know, this has been very helpful to businesses. As some of you mentioned, we are now really going towards creating a single customs territory, whereby goods can really circulate within a community, move within a community without any barriers, where they can just go through one entry point and through one exit point. As you know, we are also working on many other aspects. Under the common market pillar, we are working on so many actions to make sure that people can move freely, businesses can settle in other EAC countries without any of these traditional impediments that you, I'm sure, as a business community, all know about. We have also been working on so many other aspects to make sure that the environment, I think, when you talk about really business development, you talk about the environment. Businesses have to be able to find a playground whereby businesses from Kenya can actually operate in Uganda as if they were in Kenya. So we are working on so many things. Harmonization of standards. We have been working on coordinating the different ministries and institutions in partner states so that they can all have the same understanding of how our businesses need to operate in the community. Now, I think you went from the continental free trade area. EAC is, as you know, is part of the tripartite, EAC, SADC, and COMESA. And I think we should actually take a lot of pride in having really been in the forefront when it came to this idea of free trade area. As of last year, the tripartite EAC, SADC, and COMESA had attained very, very interesting results in that sense that 21 countries out of 26 had already signed the free trade area agreement. And as Minister Mohammed mentioned it, now the African Union, in its meeting just a few days ago in Kigali, just extended that number to 24 countries. For us, this is a tremendous opportunity for our businesses to thrive, to reach a much larger customer base, to become strong. And of course, our hope would be that businesses within East Africa can actually reach out outside of Africa. And I think this CFTA will enable us to really come out with very strong companies and hopefully which can be able to compete in international markets.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll now turn to Dr. Donald Kaberuka. You recently left the African Development Bank and came back to being somebody like us within East Africa. Now, from your experience at the African Development Bank and looking at the CFTA and all the different regional economic communities that existed before, in terms of getting the sort of financial flows and getting all of them to work together, the different currencies, different economic policies and so forth, is this going to be something that can work quickly? Is this something that will go slowly? And what role do you think organizations like the African Development Bank can play in making this accelerate?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. I think the most important things have been said by Prime Minister and the ministers. There's not much more to add. And of course, I can't speak for the African Development Bank. You said I've become like you, so. So that's not my role anymore. I just have 3 small points to add to these wonderful points. Number 1, tariffs are a problem, and bringing them down will always help. But in my experience, across Africa, it is other things which are very damaging. And these are non-tariff restrictions. Whether they are tariff-like measures, whether they are outrun import bans, whether they're related to safeguards and health and equality, those issues have to be tackled. If we succeed to bring down the tariffs, which I think we will, and unless there was a commensurate effort on the non-tariff restrictions, this will not go very far. So I hope and expect that ministers here will continue to do what they're doing quite well to address these non-tariff measures. The second thing I would like to add is what Minister Aidan had just mentioned. This is about trade, but it's largely about investment. Many investors coming to Africa today would be confronted by a couple of issues: logistics, power, cost, and all this. But also constrained not simply by market size, but market diversity. And I think the ability of investors now to see a larger, more diverse market will make investments flow, in my judgment, better than it was before. The third point I would like to add, I don't know why this is the right place to say it, but Prime Minister, since you are here, I want to address the people here and those outside this room. Far too often, the slow movement at opening up markets has been caused by business people lobbying government. It has often been businesses actually lobbying governments not to open up. In fact, some governments which have not yet signed Kigali agreement, it was because there have to be a conversation with the local business communities. So I'm hoping that business here will be champions to try to convince their governments that indeed, while some businesses will not be able to compete, there can be measures to help them out temporarily. But as a general principle, I do think that the experience in this region, particularly in Comesa, it had demonstrated that when you bring down barriers, everyone is a beneficiary. It's not a zero-sum game. It's an appeal to businesses here. It's not simply about governments. It's about manufacturers, it's about traders who are used to operate behind high tariff barriers, actually asking the government to say, please, can you go slow? Now, the final point is about payment systems. Long time ago in Comesa, there was an attempt to create something called the PTA unit of account. And there was a clearinghouse in Harare. It was an attempt to overcome the fact that we trade each other through dollars, euros, other currencies. I don't know how much progress the PTA unit of account made. I think it had to be closed down at some point. Maybe Secretary General knows. But we'll have to work much more on payment systems using many of these digital platforms existing at the moment. So banks and the regulators will have a lot of work to be done, and so on. So I guess what I'm saying to you is that bringing tariffs is important. It is key. But it is absolutely the first journey on a long trip, which must cover non-tariff restrictions, which must cover payment systems, action on the currencies, harmonization of policies, the whole lot of things which ministers here are familiar with. But otherwise, everything else has been said.
Thank you, Dr. Kaberuka. And now to Dennis Carrera. I think you've heard all the ministers, the Secretary General, and Dr. Kaberuka talking about the private sector and how, as a private sector, we're the ones who sort of go back and derail what you'd ask for when you get behind closed doors. So from your view, what role do you think the private sector has? What do you think the private sector has in helping to realize this whole vision that our political class, the ministers and everybody else have put together around the Continental Free Trade Agreement, but also just from the Eabc point of view with our own operations in East Africa? What can we bring to the table to make this realized?
Well, thank you, Patrick. I'm glad, first of all, you put me last, because everybody's from the public sector, except me directly from the private sector. I have a colleague who is newly joined the private sector. You have a new entrant. Thank you. Now, for me, I have a mix of things in my head, given the new dawn of Africa that we saw 2 days ago. And it comes with a call, it comes with an appeal, it comes with a certain level of disappointment. Because when we talk of the East African Business Council, East African, and I see in this hall, we are not 1,000 yet. I have a problem with that. Having been a chair in this particular council, you drive this agenda, you make calls, and you don't see everybody here. I begin to think, do we actually see where we are headed, or we do not? Because all the issues that have been discussed by the panelists, the competition that is going to come up, the will that we have seen, including even the no willingness from different member states, how we